Hello, folks. This is October 2nd, Friday, and this is the Daily Word in the Crisis. And today is a rant if there ever was one, but it's also a strong exhortation. In this election cycle, it's more important than it has ever been for us to examine carefully what's happening and who's behind it. Look closely at New York, where churches cannot meet, where people are forbidden to gather, unless, of course, it's a protest of some sort, and where restaurants cannot have indoor dining. Look at California and a handful of other states where similar draconian restrictions are in place. Look at Moscow, Idaho, where local officials arrested the leadership of an outdoor worship service where people were singing hymns. All these places are governed by Democrats who justify their actions on the basis of claims that the pandemic is a monstrous public risk. But it seems to me that all this just isn't justified by the actual numbers. But that's another discussion. Then understand that all that our governing officials need to do now to deprive us of our constitutional rights and cause us to live submissively under what is, for all intents and purposes, a dictatorship, is to declare an emergency of some kind. In the face of this, how many churches will knuckle under and submit like sheep to mandated closures while they misinterpret and misapply the Romans 13 command to submit to governing authorities, taking it out of context while feeling all holy about it as they surrender to tyranny? It's fair to ask, when the COVID crisis ends, what emergency will take its place now that certain governing officials know what they can get away with? Will the climate crisis be the next so-called emergency that justifies restricting our freedoms? What will they take from us then? What other so-called emergency will be declared that delivers virtual dictatorial powers to governors and mayors? Will the riots that have been funded, planned, and fueled by outside forces ultimately justify declarations of martial law under which none of our constitutional rights will matter? America, we're being conditioned to accept a new normal we will all hate if we haven't fallen so deeply asleep under the constant barrage of fear that we won't even notice what we've lost as the nation collapses around us. Now, I'm not one to sow fear, I'm really not. But I am one to observe and warn of trends and possibilities. Prophets sometimes predict coming events. Other times, they simply warn of possibilities and of things that will happen if the people of God or the people of a nation in general fail to heed warnings. So I'm not saying that any of this will inevitably happen. Let me be clear about that. But I am saying that it could happen if Americans don't wake up and vote these people out of office. We wouldn't lose our rights all at once. We would lose them one little bit at a time so that we wouldn't quite notice until it was too late. And it would all seem so reasonable. Holding the line against all this requires that we stop voting emotionally in reaction to personalities and to claims made by politicians who understand that making people feel things and elicit an emotional reaction will determine the way people vote. They don't want us to think and reason because that would reveal the truth. They know how to use the media. They know how to manipulate words and perceptions in order to elicit the emotional responses that will get them elected and cause us to give them power over our lives. So I'm pleading that we must look beyond the individual men running for office, look beyond their personalities that we may or may not like, look past the visceral emotional reactions to them, and examine party platforms rationally. Look carefully at the records of those running for office, what they've produced. Stop paying attention to the well-crafted ads they run that are designed to make you feel something without thinking. Look instead at what has actually been done and what those actions have actually produced. Where were you 6 years ago? 6 months ago. Where were you 6 months ago? Where were you in January 2020 before the COVID crisis struck? Well, for that matter, where were you 6 years ago before the current administration took office? And where were you in January 2020 before the COVID crisis struck? When you were freer, when you were more prosperous, Looking back from January until now, are you safer than you were then? Who is protecting you, and who is allowing our cities to burn? Who has offered to send in federal help to quell the destruction and the loss of life? And who has not only refused that help, but tied the hands of law enforcement to allow the destruction to continue? The first presidential debate was a debacle by anybody's true measure. I found it an embarrassment. But I plead with everyone to see past that and compare the records of the men involved. Who has achieved what in real terms? Think it through. If there seem to be no truly holy choices for president or any other public office, then consider the following. Abraham, father of our faith, gave his wife into a foreign king's harem to save his own skin. But God didn't reject or fire him as the chosen one. At the end of his life, he was called the friend of God. King Saul was so disobedient and so unjustly jealous of David to the point of hunting him to kill him that he became demonized by an evil spirit Scripture says was from the Lord. But until the day he died of suicide after losing a battle, he remained the Lord's anointed. King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, got her pregnant, and then sought to cover his sin and cause people to think the child had been conceived through intercourse with her husband. When that didn't work, because her husband, having been called back from the battlefield, refused to go into his wife while his men were still fighting, David arranged for her husband to be killed in a way that made it appear he was a battle casualty. But God didn't fire him. God didn't fire David for all that, or declare him unchosen. The prophet Nathan confronted him with his sin, as a genuine prophet should. Convicted, David wholeheartedly repented and was disciplined by the Lord, but not dismissed as king. He remained the father of the dynasty that brought forth Jesus. At the end of his life, in spite of his now checkered past, he was hailed as the man after God's own heart. But in our day, we vote into office an imperfect man with a checkered moral past and an unguarded mouth, and then so many of us allow ourselves to be caught up in the tsunami wave of hatred sweeping the land, and we tear him apart for his past and his present trespasses, until I want to cry out, what a bunch of Pharisees. I plead with all of you to get past all that and examine party platforms. Come away from emotional manipulation by biased news agencies and attack ads that are designed to twist perceptions. Examine the actual policies of those on the ballot, as well as the fruit born before the COVID crisis, the fruit that was born before the COVID crisis so confused everything. Remember that more important than electing a president, we're electing a political party. That party, more than the man in the office, will determine our future and the nature of our freedoms. What do the parties stand for? What are they actually saying and doing? Do those platforms reflect biblical values and biblical morality? Pray and then vote. God bless you all, and I pray that you have a really good weekend.